I'm not a historian, neither am I a scholar. My family has no known military history, no gray-haired grandfather with a chest full of medals and a heart full of secrets. I'm merely a Canadian, a patriot who cries when the national anthem is played at hockey games and when anyone recites in Flanders Fields. I applied to be part of the Legion Pilgrimage of Remembrance because I wanted to understand, to see where the battles took place, to touch the names on the memorials, to kneel in remembrance at a grave. Come with me on a journey through time and tears and walk as I walked in the footsteps of heroes. Our pilgrimage took us back to World Wars I and II. Today's presentation will focus primarily on World War II, which took place from 1939 to 1945. You are no doubt familiar with the heartbreak that was the Dieppe raid. Codenamed Operation Jubilee, it was an Allied assault on the German-occupied port of Dieppe, France, on the 19th of August, 1942. The main assault lasted less than 6 hours until strong German defenses and mounting Allied losses forced its commanders to call a retreat. Over 6,000 infantrymen, predominantly Canadian, were supported by the Calgary Regiment of the 1st Canadian Tank Brigade and a strong force of Royal Navy and Royal Air Force landing contingents. It involved 5,000 Canadians, as well as 1,000 British troops and 50 United States Army Rangers. Of the 6,086 men who made it ashore on the 3 beaches, 3,623, almost 60%, were either killed, wounded, or captured. Now this is Pourville Beach, the westerly of the 3 beaches which made up the Dieppe offensive. Covered in a thick layer of smooth, round, slippery pebbles, it is impossible to traverse easily, even at a leisurely midday pace. Never mind in the dark and in a hurry, carrying 80 pounds of gear and being shot at like sitting ducks from German emplacements on the chalky heights above. This one, which has fallen victim to decades of erosion, now lies on the beach, a stark reminder that time is neither considerate nor kind. This small monument is the only official recognition of what happened at Pourville in 1942. Deemed a colossal failure, the Canadian government has never sanctioned a national monument to acknowledge the Canadian effort and the Canadian sacrifice at Dieppe. Here we see the beach at Puy at the easterly end of the Dieppe raid. That same pebble and sand terrain, and those gut-wrenching, heart-stopping cliffs. La Place du Canada is a peaceful gathering place at Puy for those wanting to remember and those desperate to acknowledge a debt which can never be repaid. The plaque reads, "On this beach, officers and men of the Royal Regiment of Canada died at dawn, 19 August 1942, striving to reach the heights above. You who are alive on this beach, remember that these men died far from home, that others here and everywhere might freely enjoy life in God's mercy." Dieppe Beach, the center of the 1942 offensive, a bustling coastal tourist town before the war and after, dotted with sun worshippers and cheesy vendor huts, and memorial after memorial, erected by individual regiments to honor their comrades who fell in the tragedy which unfolded all those years ago. On this long pier, jutting out from Dieppe Beach, where the ferry comes across the channel from England, we pilgrims held a ceremony at sea, placing our poppies on a wreath, which was then tossed into the water in remembrance of those brave souls who landed on those beaches all those years ago. I came across a poem written by a Canadian soldier by the name of Gordon Barnes, who was serving with the 228th Royal Canadian Engineers. Sapper Barnes landed at Dieppe, was captured, and spent the rest of the war in a German POW camp, where he wrote a poem entitled Dieppe. It was so beautifully written, and it adapted easily into a song, which I call The Beaches at Dieppe. 'Twas the 18th day of August in 1942, when we sailed away from England and no one knew where to. We'd received no orders, no friends to see us leave. The 2nd Canadian Division with the blue patch on our sleeve. 'Twas early the next morning when everything was still. We saw those tracer bullets come at us from the hill. But the mission would continue. We could not comprehend what was about to happen. On the beaches at Dieppe, the enemy was waiting. They'd taken up their post. Amid a hail of bullets, we landed on the coast. Many men were wounded, and no one can forget the ones who died so bravely on the beaches at Dieppe. Well, it was early in the morning when we started in to fight. The mortar bombs came at us from in front and left and right. They fired at us from the cliffs, they bombed us from the air. But the 2nd Canadian Division would not so easily scare. Well, we fought for 8 long hours, from 6 a.m. till 2. The losses were terrific, there was nothing we could do. The Navy tried to help us, but they could not defend. And so we surrendered on the beaches at Dieppe. Now we've been taken prisoner in the middle of nowhere. The war goes on without us, a bitter fate to bear. Though many of our comrades fell, we never will forget. They gave their lives, they're fighting on the beaches at Dieppe. And when this war is over, and once again we're free, to our homeland we'll be sailing, to a land of liberty, carrying our battle scars, and no one will forget the morning that he landed on the beaches at Dieppe. On the morning of the day we were leaving Dieppe, we gathered on the beach at 5:20 a.m. to toast the 907 men of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division who lost their lives on that fateful and ill-fated day in the footsteps of heroes. This is Juno Beach. It was in this spot, at this moment, where I received the inspiration and the name for this presentation. At the risk of sounding trite or melodramatic, I swear to you now that as I stood there in the warm July waters of the English Channel, I was keenly aware of the presence of those boys from 1944. I felt their presence, their pain, their fear, and their blood in the footsteps of heroes. Carved into the face of this monument at Bernières-sur-Mer are the words, "Here on the 6th June, 1944, Europe was liberated by the heroism of the Allied forces." On the beach at Bernières-sur-Mer, the monument to the right of this artillery emplacement has been erected in remembrance of the Queen's Own Rifles, 8th Brigade, Canadian 3rd Infantry Division. A bronze commemoration of the involvement of the Queen's Own Rifles in 1944 to 45. This is typical of the information displayed throughout the Normandy region along the path of the D-Day invasion. The area known as Juno Beach on the coast of Normandy is broken up now by real estate and beach huts, but we walked as much of it as we could, walking, then meeting up with the bus, going a mile or so down the coast, and then walking again. Along the length of the beach at Tailleville, as the seagulls rode the wind and the sea spray washed over us, we embraced the spirits which surrounded us and those we brought with us, and we walked in the footsteps of heroes. In the days following the Normandy invasion and the Allied push inland, the Germans were on the run. They became as bandit automatons, killing prisoners rather than taking them captive. Rations were short and they had no way to properly care for prisoners who would slow them down and tax their dwindling food resources. On June 8th, 64 Canadians, including several dozen members of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, were taken prisoner during fighting near the village of Puteaux-en-Bessin. The prisoners were marched to the Château d'Audreau. Now a 5-star countryside resort, it was, in 1944, a Normandy estate commandeered by officers of the 12th SS. Later that day, 45 of the Canadians were murdered in batches in the grounds of the chateau. From a window in the kitchen at the back of the chateau, a kitchen worker observed the German captors, members of the reconnaissance battalion of the SS Hitler Youth, march the Canadians in groups of 2 or 3, or by the one, with their hands behind their heads down the long path past the chateau into the woods. It was later discovered upon revelations by the kitchen worker that they were shot and killed in the woods behind the chateau, their bodies hastily discarded, barely covered, abandoned. The first 3 bodies were discovered here. These brazen and cowardly killings took place within spitting distance of the village of Audreau, which is visible from the pathway which led down to the woods. Among the executed Canadians were George Meakin, 23, and his younger brother Frank, 20, from the tiny prairie town of Burnie, Manitoba, both of whom had come ashore and survived the fighting of D-Day. "This may be the last chance I get to write to you before the big day," wrote George Meakin in a letter to his mother before the invasion. "If you don't hear from me for a while, don't worry. Keep on smiling and everything will turn out for the best." For these 45 Canadian soldiers, the war ended not on a battlefield, but rather in a quiet, lonely woods, very nearly forgotten, in the footsteps of heroes. Other atrocities included Canadian prisoners being killed near the villages of Auty and Buron, and their bodies being dragged onto the road to be run over by tanks and trucks. French civilians who pulled the bodies off the road were ordered to drag them back into the path of German army vehicles. 37 Canadian prisoners of war were taken to the field behind us, near the village of Le Mesnil-Patrie, told to sit down, and then were mowed down by machine pistols. Knowing what was in store for them, their CO managed quietly to get word to the men at the back, and 2 of them were able to make a run for it, taking cover in a stand of maples about a quarter-mile back, thereby escaping the slaughter. Unfortunately, they were captured by another German unit and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp, in the footsteps of heroes. The most heartbreaking of these atrocities was the slaughter which took place on the 7th and 8th of June. On the 7th of June, dozens of Canadians with the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the 27th Canadian Armoured Regiment were taken prisoner following heavy fighting around the village of Oti. The Germans took their prisoners to the nearby Abbey d'Ardenne, an ancient stone church where Colonel Kurt Meyer, one of the 12th SS commanders, had set up his headquarters after D-Day. 11 of the captured Canadians were led through this entrance onto the grounds of the Abbey, past what had once been a place of holy worship, down the long path past the courtyard, past an outdoor cistern where a young Polish man, pressed into service by the Germans, quietly carried on with his task, minding his own business as the Canadians walked by. They were pushed through a doorway, and as each was summoned, he walked up the stone steps, which leads into a small garden, where they were either shot in the back of the head or bludgeoned. The next morning, June 8th, 7 more POWs, all North Nova Scotia Highlanders, were taken outside the Abbey and shot. The bodies were hastily discarded in the garden by the Germans, who then fled before the oncoming Allied offensive. In the garden of the Abbey, evil's taken hold. A lonely witness keeps his silence until it can be told. Cold-blooded murders somehow justified in the garden of the Abbey. 20 Canadians died. Through the courtyard of the Abbey, the prisoners pushed along by the ones who bury secrets and cover up their wrong. The war is nearly over, and Hitler knows it well. Take no prisoners, we can't keep them. Send them all to hell. Up a stairway in the Abbey, the German pistols spit. No escaping death with honor. They bravely take the hit. They'd stormed the beach at Juneau and fought inland to Oti for their king and for their country. True north, strong and free. Now in the garden of the Abbey, the pilgrims come to pray. A tiny altar to the fallen, the blood-red poppies lay. A lesson to remember, a another story to tell. Tell the people, tell the children, remember them well. In the garden of the Abbey, other units of the German forces in France called the Hitler Youth Division the Murder Division. After the war, the stories came forward from the kitchen worker at the chateau, the Polish man at the Abbey, and others who had witnessed similar incidents. Investigations established that separate atrocities were committed in 31 different incidents, including 1 American, 3 British, and 134 Canadians. We visited 23 cemeteries, including Maple Copse Cemetery in West Flanders, Belgium, a peaceful repose for 257 identified soldiers and another 51 who remain unknown. Lissenhoek Military Cemetery in West Flanders, Belgium, where I paid my respects to 2 of our local heroes, Private Robert H. Mark, husband of Margaret Mark of Cameron, and who died on November 3rd, 1917 at the age of 33, and Private John Wilford Shankland, son of Thomas and Wilhelmina Shankland of Fenelon Falls, and who was killed on November 9th, 1917 at the age of 19. Sun Quarry Cemetery in Chérisy, France, which is the final resting place of Private Charles Norman Metcalfe, son of George Henry and Catherine Augusta Metcalfe of Fenelon Falls. Charles's brothers, Lawrence and George, also served and returned home safely at the end of the war. At Voormezele Enclosure Number 3 on the outskirts of Ypres, Belgium, among the 1,002 buried there, our bus driver, Luke, discovered something quite remarkable. The 19th and 20th Canadian soldiers to sign up for World War I, buried a few rows from each other. Private David Geekie, age 28, and Lance Corporal C.E. Horner, age 35, stood together in the enlistment line, fought together with the PPCLI Eastern Ontario Regiment, died together on March 15, 1915, at Zevekoten, fighting for control of what is known as the Mound of Death, in which, and I quote, "The attacking force met with a terrible blast of machine gun fire, which simply mowed men down and against which all the heroism in the world could not have made progress. And together they lie for all eternity as brothers in arms in a burial field in Flanders." Bretteville-sur-Lez Cemetery lies between Caen and Falaise in the Normandy region of France. The majority of those buried at Bretteville-sur-Lez Canadian War Cemetery died during the later stages of the Battle of Normandy, the capture of Caen, and the thrust southwards, led initially by the 4th Canadian and 1st Polish Armoured Divisions to close the Falaise Gap. Almost every unit of Canadian 2nd Corps is represented in the cemetery. The cemetery contains 2,958 Second World War burials, the majority Canadian, 87 of them unidentified. At eternal rest in this cemetery is Gunner John McGrath of the Royal Canadian Artillery, who died on July 24th, 1944 at the age of 23. This young man was and is mourned by the community of Kinmount, Ontario, and the village's Legion Branch 488 is named in his honor and in his memory. The Dieppe Canadian War Cemetery in France contains Canadian and British soldiers who were killed during the Dieppe raid in August 1942. 944 members of the Allied Armed Forces are interred at Dieppe, of which 707 are Canadian. Also in the Dieppe Cemetery are the remains of one woman, Mary Janet Climpson, a British Salvation Army officer who had been killed in 1940 and who was the only civilian buried there. She was transferred from the British National Headquarters to France at the outset of World War II to assist the troops. The soldiers called her Mother C. She worked in a variety of Red Shield centers, working hard for the benefit of the soldiers, writing letters for the wounded soldiers, laying flowers for relatives on the freshly dug graves, even leading religious services. After the soldiers returned to the front line, they would often send her penciled notes on scraps of paper thanking her for her care and attention. On the 20th of May, 1940, Lieutenant Clemson was part of an evacuee convoy out of Arras during the rapid Nazi advance on northern France. While traveling towards Dieppe, the Luftwaffe began strafing along the roadway. Mrs. Brigadier Clemson, age 56, was killed during the incident. Buried in a field, her remains were later relocated to the Dieppe Canadian War Cemetery. One of our stops was at the Tyne-Cot Memorial and Cemetery in Belgium, where we held a ceremony of remembrance, as curious onlookers quickly became participants, getting in line to place a poppy. There are 34,948 names inscribed on the walls which surround the cemetery. Names of the missing, namely from the UK, including Canada and New Zealand. 11,956 servicemen are buried here, including 8,369 who are unidentified. These war dead made the supreme sacrifice during the 1914 to 1918 battles along the Ypres salient, including Passchendaele. The cemeteries are immaculate. No matter how remote, no matter how small, each one was freshly mowed. The flower beds among the gravestones were weed-free, and the sense of dedication and gratitude on the part of the workers was obvious. As we entered a cemetery, any workers present would step aside and allow us all the time we needed to do what we came to do. Our pilgrimage took place in 2013. 2014 marking the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the Great War, and in anticipation of an unprecedented number of visitors, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission put forth a mighty effort to ensure each and every cemetery and memorial site was picture perfect. At Tyne-Cot, workers were lying on the ground with tiny Dremel tools hooked up to large generators, meticulously re-etching any inscriptions which had become worn over time. I noticed one worker kneeling in front of a stone with a precision hand chisel, working on a regimental insignia. I wanted to talk to him, but as I made my way down the row, he got up and moved away, presuming I was coming to pay my respects at a particular grave. As he backed away, I kept motioning to him. He stopped, and I approached. I put out my hand, and in my broken French, I thanked him for looking after our boys. Taking the hand I offered, and in his broken English, he thanked me, he thanked Canada for giving our boys to liberate his country. We hugged and wept and wept and hugged, and then I turned away, having glimpsed a tiny morsel of understanding of what it must have been like to have one's country under siege, in the hands of an enemy, at the mercy of strangers who, for no good reason other than honor and duty, laid down their lives in a foreign land to liberate one country from the tyranny of another. In all the cemeteries we visited, we pilgrims left messages of remembrance in the visitors' books, one of which is found in each cemetery cared for by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. As we left our short notes on behalf of our communities, we read others left by fellow travelers from here in Canada and around the globe. Messages to kinfolk, to local heroes, to all brave and gallant souls whose final resting place is within the walls of these cemeteries. Not all of our stops were official in nature, but were presented to us because of the diligent research done by our guide, John Goheen. Of interest to us was this wall on La Rue de la Verger, which was the route through which the 1st Hussars and Queen's Own Rifles advanced on their way to Le Mesnil in the infamous charge of the Light Brigade of the 11th of June, 1944. With the few survivors streaming back to Norrie, Lieutenant George Rip Gordon, troop commander in C Squadron of the 1st Hussars, 6th Canadian Army Tank Regiment, brought back wounded tankers and infantry from the Queen's Own Rifles on the top of his Sherman tank. In his haste to get back to the wheat field to get more wounded, he turned the corner so sharply that his tank rolled on one tread and scraped the side of this building. 1/3 of all 1st Hussars casualties in the war were incurred on 11th of June 1944. Most of these were in B Squadron. All but one of the officers in B were killed, with a total of 96 men lost. Lieutenant Gordon survived the war in the footsteps of heroes. As I said, not all our stops were at official sites. Some were off the beaten path. One such place held particular interest for two of our pilgrims, RCAF veterans Sam and Chuck. It was a small memorial erected near the crash site of a World War II Lancaster, where the heroic actions of pilot officer Andy Minarski earned him a posthumous Victoria Cross. Andrew Charles Andy Minarski, VC, 14th of October 1916 to 13th of June 1944, was a Canadian recipient of the Victoria Cross, the highest award for bravery in the face of the enemy that can be awarded to British and Commonwealth forces. Minarski was 27 years old and flew with the 419 Moose Squadron, Royal Canadian Air Force, during the Second World War, when he gave his life attempting to help rescue a trapped crew member. His Victoria Cross was awarded in 1946, the last such award to a Canadian airman in the Second World War. Minarski lies buried in Grave 20 of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission plot in the Meharicourt Communal Cemetery near Amiens, France, in the footsteps of heroes. In 2 short weeks, through northern France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, we followed Canada's proud and storied military history through 2 world wars. We felt the pride of victory, the horror of devastation and loss, and the agony of defeat. Along the Western Front, from Passchendaele, the Somme, and Vimy, to Dieppe and Juno Beach, through the battlefields, past the monuments, and into the cemeteries we walked in the footsteps of heroes. I thank you for your time and attention, and I would like to close with Thank God for Poppies, written by Rick Hughes and recorded by us as Hughes and Wilson in 2004. In an old shoebox in the attic, I found a letter dated November 1943. It was written from my grandpa to my grandma, and I read his words sent from overseas. If I don't get home, my darling, please take care of our children. If I don't get home, my darling, please look after the farm. If I don't get home, my darling, oh please remember me. And if you do all this, I'll be there in your arms. Thank God for poppies to remind us what they've done. Thank God for poppies, our daughters and our sons, and they gave and are still giving, and we'll pray to God they'll be forever with the living. Thank God for poppies. Well, I can see him in the trenches, in a hole he dug by hand, with his rifle at the ready, waiting for command. Was it on that day he gave for us all that he could give?
Now each time I see a poppy, I can't help but think of him. If I don't get home, my darling, please take care of our children. If I don't get home, my darling, please look after the farm. If I don't get home, my darling, oh please remember me. And if you do all this, I'll be there in your arms. Thank God for poppies to remind us what they've done. Thank God for poppies, our daughters and our sons, and they gave and are still giving, and pray to God they'll be forever with the living. Thank God for poppies, forever with the living. Thank God for poppies.